It is common for people to track their calories and possibly even macronutrients too as a strategy to gain muscle or reduce body fat. But is this something that you need to do to reach your fitness goals? And is this a sustainable approach to eating for the long term? In this video, we will try to answer these questions. First, we need to understand what exactly food tracking is. Well, essentially, this is simply the concept of recording the foods you eat throughout the day and trying to meet a target calorie goal and possibly also a macronutrient goal, meaning protein, carbohydrate, and fat targets. There are numerous ways that this can be achieved in practice. Most common in modern times is to track the food you eat on a mobile application such as MyFitnessPal. You simply search for a food or scan the barcode of a label and input the quantity that you consumed. And at the end of the day, you can see how many total calories you have consumed and how many grams of each macronutrient you have consumed. Like we mentioned, there are various ways to track your food. Similarly, there are different magnitudes as to how accurately you can track. The most accurate way is to set exact energy targets to the calorie and exact macro targets to the gram, and to hit each variable to its exact target. This also requires weighing all ingredients in a meal to ensure complete accuracy, as foods may be slightly more or less weight than what the packet is labelled. On the other hand, you can track your food in more flexible ways. This might be to hit your calorie and macro target within a range rather than a set number. This could even include tracking your food pro or retrospectively. This means you could input all your planned food at the start of the day, or recall all the food you ate at the end of the day, as opposed to tracking each food as you consume it. Of course, this will be slightly less accurate compared with a more rigid approach, but does this really matter? To answer this, we need to go back a step and explore why should we even track our food in the first place. Well, the reason is to quantify what exactly you are eating, and adjust variables to help you achieve your goals. Without tracking our food, we have less knowledge about what exactly we are consuming each day from a nutritional standpoint. However, we also need to realize that no matter how accurately we track our food, we can never be 100% perfect. This is due to many reasons which we don't really have much control over. One of which is food labeling. According to the Food and Drug Administration, protein and carbohydrate content labeled on a food must be present at 80% or more of the declared value. And calorie and total fat must not be more than 120% of the labeled value. So really, calories and macros can be up to 20% different from the label to be compliant with the FDA. And when labs test foods and compare them to their labels, there are usually some notable discrepancies. For example, this study tested the actual calorie and nutrient content of some common snacks and compared this with the labeled nutrition information. This chart shows the actual weight of the food compared with what it was labeled as and how much this varied between different packets of the same snacks. For the most part, the labels were fairly accurate with the actual weight of the product, but there was a decent margin of variability. For example, Kellogg's Strawberry Pop-Tarts on average weighed almost exactly what the label stated, but this varied by plus or minus around 7% between individual packets. Furthermore, calorie content was not perfectly accurate for most foods measured either. For example, this granola bar was on average around 28 calories higher than the label suggested and varied between individual bars by a further plus or minus 20 calories or so. And when it comes to macronutrients, labels also weren't entirely accurate. For example, this triple berry smoothie had on average 22 grams of additional carbohydrates, 1.3 grams of additional fat, and an additional 3.7 grams of protein compared with the label. And the other reason that we can't be and don't need to be 100% accurate with tracking food is because we don't expend the exact same amount of energy per day anyway. Even if we control our physical activity as tightly as possible, you simply won't expend the same amount of energy per day to the calorie. Factors such as our breathing rate, heart rate, fidgeting, digestion, stress, daily step counts, etc. will all fluctuate slightly each day and will all have a small impact on total daily energy expenditure. So basically, it is essentially impossible to be 100% accurate with food tracking. And this isn't really an issue because you don't need to be 100% accurate. A more flexible approach to tracking will be sufficient as long as you are tracking with fairly consistent methods. The averages over time are much more important than being ultra precise every single day. So, tracking our foods can help us understand what we are eating. This is usually a good thing, as we can become aware of our calorie and macro intakes and make adjustments to help us reach our goals. However, there are some potential issues that food tracking can promote, which may make it less applicable as a strategy to implement. The first issue that we may run into is when trying to track unlabeled foods. Not all foods we eat come with a label with the exact serving size, calories, and macros listed. It is very difficult to accurately track a home-cooked meal, for example, which has dozens of different ingredients, most of which were probably not weighed. Furthermore, you probably don't know the exact size of the portion you were served. You can certainly estimate your meal and record what you think is the best fit, which is usually a completely viable option. However, the issue here is that we may opt to preference foods which are easier to track, which can sometimes actually result in poorer food choices. For example, a home-cooked soup or stew with vegetables and some sort of lean meat is probably going to be highly satiating, have a high amount of protein, and provide lots of micronutrients, but it is very difficult to track. Whereas a pre-packaged meal might not have the same nutritional value, but is easier to track because it has a label. So in this case, the better option may be the home-cooked meal, but we might opt for the pre-packaged meal because it is easier to track. Following on from this, the other issue which arises is difficulty in adhering to the diet during social events. Social events are probably going to be a regular occurrence in most people's lives, and they are important for many different reasons. Many social events also involve food, which usually don't come with a convenient label to track it. This may cause some stress and anxiety, and may take your attention away from actually enjoying the event. For example, if a family member cooks a meal, it probably isn't very polite to reject the meal because you can't track it, or taking out a scale to weigh it so that you can be accurate with tracking. Once again, it is completely fine if you just estimate how much food you ate after the event, but it is difficult to completely focus your attention away from food tracking if this is something you were trying to do. Furthermore, this can sometimes result in uncontrolled binging as a result. If you have been very deprived of certain foods that you weren't able to track, it is fairly common for people to overindulge at times when they can't be meticulous with food tracking. Another potential issue with tracking food is that it can cause us to focus more on numbers and less on feelings and sensations. When the goal is to hit number targets, we try to fit foods into our diet that fit these numbers. From a physiological standpoint, it doesn't really matter what you focus on as long as you are meeting your calorie and macro needs. However, this can be an issue for long-term diet practices as it deviates our attention away from subjective feelings, which can be useful for the purposes of weight management. Namely, we may pay less attention to hunger and satiety signals, which are our biological way of telling us when we require more or less food. Focusing purely on hunger and satiety signals also has its own downsides too, but I don't think it is something that we should disregard. Ignoring hunger and satiety cues can make it difficult to eat a reasonable quantity and quality of food in relation to your nutrition goals at times when tracking is not viable. Most people probably don't want to track every single meal for the rest of their lives, so inevitably there will be times where we need to rely more on these biological feelings to inform eating choices. Furthermore, there may even be times where you don't necessarily want to eat from a physiological perspective, but you end up eating just because you need to hit your targets. If you weren't tracking your food in this instance, you may have just not eaten that meal, resulting in a lower calorie intake with less effort. The next potential issue that food tracking can promote is an excessive food focus throughout the day. This refers to being overly concerned with what you are going to eat at what times and anticipating the meal hours in advance. Food tracking can often exacerbate food focus as you are more frequently being made aware of what you need to eat and how many calories you have left throughout the day. This usually results in thinking more about food choices and how they can fit into your allotted calorie and macro targets. This can increase overall diet stress and may decrease long-term adherence. Excessive food focus can eventually result in burnout and is probably also just not a very pleasant way to live. Lastly, and the biggest potential issue, is that an excessive food focus can also promote disordered eating behaviors. Although eating disorders are complex and multifactorial, research tends to suggest that food tracking may be a contributing factor. For example, this study took 105 individuals diagnosed with an eating disorder and explored how the MyFitnessPal calorie tracker was involved with their disorder. Quite alarmingly, it was found that around 75% of subjects reported using MyFitnessPal, and around 73% of these users perceived that it somewhat contributed to their eating disorder. While it is certainly possible to track your food without experiencing disordered eating behaviors, we should just be aware that excessive focus on hitting your calorie and macro targets may be a contributing factor. So while food tracking is a useful tool to assess dietary intake, it does have some potential downsides which can make it unsustainable for long-term use in some cases. So in these cases, what alternatives do we have that allow us to meet our goals without tracking our food? Well, there are multiple strategies we can implement which can help us to reach our goals without tracking. The first and probably most important metric to actually track is our body weight over time. Whether we are tracking our food or not, our change in body weight will tell us whether we are in a calorie surplus, deficit, or at maintenance. So if we simply record our body weight over time, we can use trends to assess our calorie requirements based on our current goals. We can then adjust our eating behaviors to increase, decrease, or maintain our current calorie intake. The good thing is that body weight tracking is very easy and convenient. We just need to step on the scale a few times per week and record our body weight. Another strategy which can help us eat appropriately is to be mindful of our hunger and satiety signals. As we mentioned earlier, our body has physiological systems which attempt to regulate food intake naturally. This is via multiple different components which result in feelings of hunger and satiety. As a very simple overview, when we feel hungry, it is a signal to eat. Then this causes us to feel satiated, which is a signal to stop eating. And we can use these signals to make informed diet decisions. If we want to eat in a calorie deficit, feeling slightly hungry at certain times throughout the day is probably a positive sign that you are eating in a calorie deficit. And if you aim to eat in a surplus, you probably want to make sure you eat until you are physiologically satiated. We can use this in conjunction with our body weight to make informed decisions to manipulate calorie intake. It should also be noted that we are specifically referring to physiological hunger and satiety signals, not desire to eat. Our desire to eat, or not to eat, is influenced by hunger and satiety, but is also influenced by many other factors, such as our food environment, emotional state, eating habits, and much more. So for this strategy, we are purely trying to focus on physiological signals as opposed to our desire to eat triggered by other factors. The next strategy we can use to manipulate calories and macronutrients is via food selection. The foods we eat will obviously have an impact on calorie and macronutrient intake without necessarily having to record the exact nutrient profile of our meals. For example, this study observed energy intake in 151 adults across 2 days. Subjects self-selected foods from an extensive menu for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks each day. They were provided with as much or as little food as they wanted at each meal and could request food at any time of the day. If we look at these graphs, we can see that based on the foods that were selected, subjects tended to see differences in calorie intake. It was found that those who consumed more protein throughout the day tended to naturally eat in a slight calorie deficit, shown by this negative slope. Those who consumed more non-dairy drinks tended to naturally eat in a slight surplus. Those who consumed more variety in their diet also tended to eat in a slight surplus. And the biggest predictor of higher energy intake was the calorie density of the foods eaten. In other words, more calorie-dense food choices tended to result in a greater calorie intake, as we would expect. So this suggests that we can manipulate energy intake to some extent via food selection alone. To promote a calorie deficit, we should probably opt to select a solid protein source in each meal, minimize intake of calories from beverages, preference foods with a low calorie density, and possibly stick to similar food choices each day. And in opposition, dietary choices which will promote a calorie surplus would be the opposite. Lower protein diet, consuming more liquid calories, consuming highly calorie-dense foods, and varying your diet drastically from day to day. Another strategy that can influence food intake is meal frequency. The number of meals we consume per day can influence how much total energy we intake. This systematic review compiled and analysed the evidence exploring meal frequency on calorie intake. The researchers concluded that eating more frequent meals throughout the day was associated with an increased calorie intake. On average, the studies find that higher meal frequencies tend to result in subjects consuming around 200 more calories compared with lower meal frequency interventions. So trainees can intentionally manipulate meal frequency to suit their goals. If you were trying to eat in a deficit, you might want to consume a slightly lower meal frequency, around 2 to 3 meals per day. Whereas if you were aiming to eat in a surplus and are struggling to eat enough food, then a higher meal frequency might help, eating around 4 to 6 meals per day. A strategy to help trainees implement some of these ideas in practice is to develop diet heuristics. These are just general rules that you follow which help to manipulate calorie and macronutrient intake. And based on your current goals and personal preferences, you can implement specific heuristics which help to control your nutrition without tracking your food. For example, let's say a trainee was aiming to reduce body fat while simultaneously wanting to preserve muscle mass. In this case, we probably want to eat in a small calorie deficit with a moderate to high protein intake. Some heuristics that can help us achieve this might be the following. Consume 3 meals per day, consume a protein source with each meal, ensure you are consuming at least 1 serving of fruits or vegetables with each meal, preference low calorie dense foods and minimize intake of highly calorie dense foods, eat until you are satiated but not overly full, and don't eat until you feel physiologically hungry. No snacks between meals, minimize intake of calories from beverages, and you could add any other heuristic that might make the diet more likely to be successful based on your personal eating habits and your current food environment. If a trainee was to adhere to these heuristics, we are increasing the likelihood of them eating in a calorie deficit and consuming sufficient protein. It is certainly possible to still eat in a surplus following these guidelines, but it is much less likely. Furthermore, using a heuristics approach can allow you to meet your guidelines in different situations, such as social events, which is often an issue with food tracking. And if you aren't able to meet your dietary goals with these heuristics, you can either add more to further restrict the diet, or you could simply change some rules that are better suited to your personal behaviors. So far, we have discussed some of the issues that can arise via food tracking and some alternative strategies which can allow you to meet your nutrition goals without tracking. However, when could it potentially be a good idea to track your food? There are cases where I think food tracking can certainly be a helpful strategy to implement. The first scenario where tracking can be beneficial for people is when you are fairly new to nutrition and diet manipulation in general. Food tracking can teach you the fundamentals of calorie and macronutrient intake, which are the most important nutrition considerations when it comes to body composition. You can learn how many calories you are currently consuming and what foods have different ratios of protein, carbohydrates, and fat. I think this is beneficial for most people to attempt at some point, especially as a newcomer to the nutrition space. This is because without some basic knowledge about calories and macros, it is difficult to manipulate diet via some of the other strategies we mentioned. For example, making appropriate food choices will be more difficult because you may not know which foods have a higher or lower calorie density and which foods have more or less of each macronutrient. Furthermore, this can make your diet much more sustainable and flexible in the long term. This is because even if you have a decent idea of which foods are generally healthy versus unhealthy, which is not necessarily an accurate way to categorize foods, but that is a different topic, you may find that some foods which you thought were not appropriate to eat actually have a decent calorie and macronutrient profile. And other foods which you thought were good choices actually have way more calories than you thought. So this can open up your food choices to a larger variety as opposed to only eating specific foods that are deemed healthy or clean. This can make your diet more enjoyable and may make it more compatible with your family and social life. Another scenario where tracking may be more or less of a viable option is during periods of intentional weight loss compared with weight gain. Most people don't seem to have an issue with intentionally gaining weight from an adherence perspective. Of course, we want to make sure a calorie surplus is controlled to avoid gaining weight too fast, but we have more flexibility when eating in a surplus compared with a deficit. This is because eating more calories means we can eat a wider variety of foods and still reach our calorie and macronutrient targets. So in this case, tracking is probably less appropriate for most people. However, when it comes to weight loss, this is where trainees usually require more control and structure to adhere to a deficit. This is because there is more incentive to eat during a deficit, so some external metrics can help to keep them on track for the day. So I would say that tracking your food is probably going to be more appropriate when losing weight compared with gaining for the most part. Another time when tracking your food is going to be more appropriate is during times of unsustainable leanness. The key word here is unsustainable. This refers to getting lean to the point where extended periods of time at such low body fat levels are likely to have negative health effects. While this is not recommended to maintain long term, some trainees will intentionally get to this point temporarily. This may be for performance-related goals for a specific sporting event, or for aesthetic goals like a bodybuilding or physique competition. To get to such extreme levels of leanness, it usually requires pushing beyond what the body is physiologically comfortable doing. This means it is difficult to rely purely on behaviors or hunger and satiety signals, since such signals are going to be strongly pushing you to eat more food in such a state. So tracking your food is probably going to be helpful for these endeavors, since it gives objective data to follow for a temporary period of time. So based on all this information, let's now establish some practical recommendations. Food tracking is a strategy that can help us quantify our calorie and macronutrient intake. And although it is more precise than most other forms of nutrition interventions, it is almost impossible to be 100% accurate. And this isn't an issue, since small fluctuations in diet are going to have minimal impact on body composition outcomes when averaged out over time. While tracking food can be useful, it also has some potential downsides. Food tracking can sometimes cause us to make poorer food choices than we otherwise would have, as we are more likely to track foods that has its nutrition labeled. Furthermore, it can make it difficult to stick to your diet during social events. Tracking also takes your focus away from our inherent physiological signals, which are designed to regulate food intake, and instead shifts our attention to numbers and metrics. And in some cases, obsessive food tracking can promote a poor relationship with food and potentially some eating disorders. So if you don't want to track your food, there are some alternative ways to still meet your nutrition goals. Instead, you could just track your body weight, use hunger and satiety signals, be intentional with food selection, and manipulate your meal frequency. Using these tools, you can create heuristics which can guide eating decisions in line with your goals. There are also certain scenarios where food tracking is probably going to be especially useful. Tracking is probably going to be useful for beginners in the nutrition space, as it can help to learn the fundamentals of calorie balance, macronutrients, and food selection. Furthermore, tracking is probably going to be more appropriate during periods of weight loss or maintenance compared with weight gain, and especially during times when you plan to reach unsustainable leanness levels. So overall, there are no universal recommendations as to whether food tracking should be conducted for everyone. In certain situations, tracking can be a great tool, and in other situations, it may just not be compatible with your lifestyle or personality traits. So based on experience and current nutrition goals, each individual can decide if tracking is appropriate for them or not at the current point in time. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.